There was a morning in the late autumn of her 4th year on that land when a woman named Cora Vass stood inside a cedar thicket so dense the November sky was reduced to a grey stitch overhead, and the man who held the note on half the county's grazing leases stepped up to the fence line she had cut and braced and strung with her own 2 hands. And he looked at her, the way a man looks at a thing he expects to buy for almost nothing. His name was Delaney Marsh, and he had driven out from town in a truck whose chrome caught the pale light like a boast. He had a folded paper in his coat pocket and a smile that was doing the work his manners had quit. Behind Cora, somewhere in the cedar dark, a pig coughed and moved, and the sound of rooting came up out of the earth like a low, persistent argument. Cora said nothing. She rested her forearms on the top wire and watched Delaney Marsh the way a person watches weather that is still far off but coming. He unfolded the paper. He named a number. Cora looked at the number written there the same way she had looked at the 38 acres the first time she'd walked them. Not with disappointment, not with excitement, but with a quiet arithmetic already running behind her eyes, measuring what most people missed. She did not take the paper. She did not raise her voice. She simply set the number aside in her mind the way you set a stone aside to see what lies underneath. 3 years earlier, the people of that county had watched Cora Vass pay back taxes on a cedar-drowned parcel and decided collectively that grief had finished whatever common sense she'd had. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The land in question sat at the eastern crook of a dry creek valley, 38 acres, that an absentee owner in another state had stopped paying taxes on 6 years prior, letting the cedar move in the way cedar does in that part of the country, silently, completely, the way a debt moves when no one is watching it. Cedar is not a tree that announces itself. It comes in from the margins, and it crowds, and it darkens, and it pulls the water table down toward itself, and holds every inch of moisture at its roots, and gives nothing back. And in a decade, it can turn what was once open grass into a dim tunnel of red bark and drooping boughs that smells like a cedar chest and offers human family as a cedar chest does. The county had auctioned a parcel on a grey Tuesday in March for $3,400 in back taxes and accrued fees. Cora Vass was the only bidder. People standing on the courthouse steps that morning had conversations about her in voices just low enough to be unkind. She had sold the small house she and her late husband, Arlen, had owned in town 8 months after his funeral, paying off what they owed and putting what remained, $1,900, in a coffee can she kept in the cabinet above the stove. And she had moved herself and her 2 Berkshire sows and 1 boar and a borrowed stock trailer out to her sister-in-law's pasture corner. And she had spent the better part of a year asking questions. No one expected her to ask about land and water and cedar and the ancient practice of using pigs as a kind of deliberate, motivated, earth-moving force. People were kind to her face. What they said behind her back was a shorter sentence. The woman who had seen something in the absentee parcel before the auction was not a woman who had grown up farming. Cora had been a bookkeeper for most of her adult life. She kept accounts for 3 small businesses in town, and she was good at it, and what that work had given her, beyond a modest income, was a very particular habit of mind. The habit of looking at what a column of numbers was actually saying underneath what it appeared to be saying. She had learned that a business that looked profitable could be bleeding in places the owners refused to examine, and a business that looked marginal could be sitting on an asset no one had bothered to value correctly. Land, she had decided, was not so different from a set of books. You had to know what line to look at. You had to know what had been left out of the ledger. What had been left out of the parcel's ledger, as Cora had understood it during her quiet months of inquiry, was water. The valley's old-timers, fewer every year, remembered when that East Crook had run a seasonal creek reliable enough to water cattle through July. That creek had not run visibly in going on 30 years, and the common understanding in the county was that the aquifer had simply dropped the way aquifers dropped, and that was the end of that story. Cora had found an elderly man named Vidor Zenthi, who had come to that county from a river valley in Hungary in 1959 and farmed the adjacent parcel until his knees gave out, and Vidor Zenthi had a different understanding. He sat in a wooden chair in his kitchen, and he told her, in an accent that turned every vowel into something musical, that the water had not gone. The water was being held. The cedar was holding it. "Remove the cedar," Vidor said, "and let the ground breathe, and the water would answer." He said something else that morning, stirring his coffee slowly. He said, "The root that closes a thing is the same root that shows you where the thing is." Cora had written it on a piece of paper and tucked the paper in her pocket, and she thought about it for several days before she understood that he was talking about the cedar roots threading down toward the buried moisture, and that the cedar, for all the damage it had done, was also a map. She drove back out to the parcel 3 times before the auction. She walked it in February mud, with her boots soaking through, pushing through cedar boughs that dragged at her coat, and she counted trees, not all of them, but enough, estimating by sections, and she calculated roughly how many years of water those trees had been intercepting. She looked at the low point of the land, the elbow of the old creek bed, and she saw what no one had commented on because no one had looked. A stone and mortar box, maybe 4 feet square, set into the earth at the creek bend, its lid broken and cedar litter heaped over it, mossy and almost invisible, a spring box built by someone long before her time. It was dry, completely dry, but it had been built there for a reason, and reasons like that did not evaporate. They waited. She paid $3,400 at the courthouse on that gray Tuesday and drove back to her sister-in-law's pasture corner and sat in her truck for a few minutes, and then climbed out and looked at her pigs and said quietly, to no one in particular, "All right then." The first summer was cedar work. Cora had no tractor and no money for a crew. What she had was time, which is a currency that does not appear on any balance sheet but spends as surely as cash. And she had her pigs, and she had a second-hand chainsaw she'd bought for $200 from an estate sale in April, and she had the knowledge, gathered from Vidor Zenthi and from a county extension pamphlet she'd read, until the pages went soft, that Berkshire pigs in a cedar thicket would root out the fine roots, the feeder roots, the lateral structures that drew water from the soil, and that, without those roots, the cut stumps would not throw new growth the way cedar stumps otherwise. The pigs were not ornamental about this. They were systematic in the way only hungry, curious animals can be, working a section of ground the way Cora worked a set of books, methodically, missing nothing, returning to a page until every entry was accounted for. She began in May, cutting cedar in sections, dragging the slash to burn piles at the edge of the property, rotating her small herd of pigs. The 2 sows had produced, by then, 11 piglets across 2 litters, making 13 animals in total, through the cleared sections on a rough schedule she kept in a notebook. Each pig, she estimated, was capable of turning approximately 400 square feet of root-threaded ground in a week of concentrated work. 13 pigs across a coordinated rotation could work a half-acre in a week if the ground was neither too wet nor too hard. She noted this in her notebook with the same precision she had once noted accounts payable. The math was not glamorous. It did not have to be. June brought heat and the smell of cut cedar so strong it sat in her clothes and her hair, and she stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the smell of your own kitchen. She worked from first light until the heat of the afternoon stopped her, and then she rested in the thin shade of the slash piles and watched her pigs work, and then she rose and worked again until the light failed. She had strung a single electrical line to a small shed she built from salvaged lumber at the parcel's edge, enough to run a lamp and a fan, and a chest freezer she used to store pork she culled from the herd to keep the numbers manageable. She ate well enough. She slept like something exhausted and purposeful. Her neighbor to the north, a rancher named Cleet Purvis, watched from his fence line that first summer with the expression of a man who has already written an ending and is waiting for the story to catch up with it. He said to her in June, when she was pulling cedar past his fence, that she was working hard for nothing. He said the water was gone and she was going to realize that when the time came, and it would be a shame. He said it in the tone of a man who finds shameful things mildly enjoyable. Cora nodded and kept pulling. Cleet Purvis went back to his truck. Vidos Zenther came on Thursdays. He walked slowly now and carried a stick for the uneven ground, but he walked the cleared sections with the attentiveness of a man reading something he had written long ago. He would stop and press the end of his stick into the earth and look at the sky and make a small sound of consideration. One Thursday in July, he stopped at the elbow of the old creek bed and looked at the broken spring box and said, "This one is limestone underneath. Limestone holes." Cora looked at the spring box and said, "How long?" Vidor Zenther was quiet for a moment. He said, "When the roots are gone, not long. The second summer was when the pigs found it." Cora had cleared approximately 19 acres by the end of the first year, roughly half the parcel, and the cedar she had not yet reached still stood thick and dark on the western slope, but the eastern section was open now in a way that changed the quality of light on the land entirely. The sky coming back in broad and the ground showing a dozen shades of brown and grey where the root mat had been broken and turned. The pigs, rotating through the cleared ground in their patient sections, had grown. The first 2 litters had been joined by a third, and Cora had sold 7 animals that winter at a small regional auction, quietly, without announcement, for a total of $940, which she applied to a property tax installment and a new set of fencing tools. She had reinvested in 2 more Berkshire gilts from a breeder 3 counties over her herd, now numbered 17. It was the largest of the sows. An animal the small girl who helped her had named Basin, for reasons the girl never fully explained, who went to work on the ground at the creek elbow on a Tuesday morning in early June of the second year, and did not stop for the better part of 4 days. Cora noticed the behavior. Pigs signal their intentions through the character of their rooting, a sustained, focused dig being a different thing entirely from the idle snuffling that means nothing in particular, and she began extending Basin's time on that section. By Thursday afternoon, the spring box was fully exposed, the cedar litter cleared, the broken lid set aside, and the earth around it dark and damp in a ring roughly 6 feet in diameter. By Friday morning, there was water standing in the box to a depth of 4 inches. Cool water, clear after the first clouding, settled tasting of limestone and depth and age. Cora knelt beside it for a long time. She put her hand in the water. She did not make a dramatic gesture. She was a bookkeeper, and what she felt was the satisfaction of a column that had finally balanced. The small girl, who had been coming to help since the previous autumn, was named Petra Wilkes. She was 9 years old and belonged, loosely speaking, to a household a half-mile down the road where belonging was a complicated question and no one kept close track. She had first appeared at Cora's fence line on a September morning, carrying nothing, watching the pigs with the focused attention of someone who has found a thing that makes sense to them in a world that mostly does not. Cora had put her to work filling water troughs and moving electric fence stakes, which Petra did without complaint, and with a precision that suggested she was accustomed to figuring things out without instruction. She named the pigs, not all of them, which would have been a sentimental error, but the important ones, the ones with distinct characters. Basin, who was the digger; Flint, the aggressive boar who challenged every new section of ground as though it had insulted him; a gilt she called Morrow, who farrowed with unusual consistency and whose offspring were notably hardy. Cora did not discourage the naming. Names were a form of observation, and observation was what the work required. Petra was there the morning the spring box filled. She looked at the water standing in the stone box, and she said, "I knew it was down there. Cora asked her how she had known. Petra said, Basin kept coming back to the same place, even when you moved her. Cora looked at the girl with the attention she would have given a set of books that turned out to be more revealing than expected. She said, That's right. Petra said nothing more. She picked up a fence stake and went back to work. The water rose over the following weeks as the remaining cedar on the western slope came down through the rest of that summer. Cora hired a man with a small bulldozer for 3 days in August, a controlled expense, $480 for the 3 days, which she had saved across 6 months to push the heaviest remaining stumps, and the pigs followed the bulldozer's passes like a second and more thorough crew. By September, the spring was flowing. By September, not a torrent, it was never going to be a torrent, but a steady seep that filled the box and overflowed in a narrow sheet and ran along the old creek bed for roughly 200 yards before it sank back into the gravel. Enough for stock. Enough for a market garden, if it came to that. Enough to matter. Cora kept this quiet. She noted the flow in her notebook. She had measured it with a bucket and a watch. Approximately 9 gallons per hour at the lowest ebb, 17 at the highest, consistent with limestone aquifer behavior, and she noted what the water meant for the stocking capacity of the land. Ground with a seed mix of native grasses and clover. She had sourced from the State Extension Service at cost. She did not tell Cleet Purvis. She did not mention it at the feed store in town. Fedor Zemty came on Thursday and she showed him, and he pressed his stick into the earth near the spring box and made a small sound of consideration, and then said the thing he had said to her before: the route that closes a thing is the same route that shows you where the thing is. It landed differently the second time. It landed like a thing that was true in more than one direction. She was banking the success the way you bank a coal under ash, keeping it covered, keeping it alive, letting the heat build without letting the light out. She had learned, in years of keeping other people's books, that a thing declared too early becomes a target. She was not ready for targets. She was not ready for Delaney Marsh, who controlled the 4 largest grazing leases in the county, and who set the price at which most of the county's small operators sold their feeder pigs, because he also controlled the only reliable transport contract to the regional packing facility. She had sold her 7 animals the previous winter through the small regional auction specifically to avoid his pricing, and she knew he had noticed the way a man notices when something he expected to control does something unexpected. Delaney Marsh had a way of presenting his interest in other people's problems as concern. He had come to Cora's parcel twice in the first year, leaning on the fence with his hat pushed back, telling her what a hard thing she had taken on, and how the water situation was a known problem on that East Crook, and how, if she ever found herself wanting to sell the back portion, just the back portion, he said, just the lower 12 acres, he would be more than fair. He named a figure. It was less than what she had paid in back taxes for the entire parcel. He said it without embarrassment because Cora understood he had no reason yet to be embarrassed. The story he was living in still had her losing. She said, I'll keep what I have. He said, well, the offer stands. He said it with a warmth that was a door closing. By the 3rd autumn, things were different. Not loud different, not the kind of different that announces itself, just the kind that a person keeping careful accounts would notice. The pasture in the cleared cedar ground was coming in. Cora had 61 pigs, not counting the spring litters, still on the sow. She had fenced the parcel into 7 rotation paddocks, and she was running the herd through them on a 28-day cycle that kept the grass from being overgrazed and kept the pigs in a state of permanent, productive curiosity, because there was always new ground ahead of them. She was selling animals 4 times a year now, bypassing Delaney Marsh's transport contract entirely by working out an arrangement with a small butcher operation 2 counties. over whose owner had heard about her Berkshires through the kind of word that travels quietly among people who care about quality. The butcher's name was Inez Varela, and she paid Cora $43 per hundredweight above what Delaney Marsh's contract offered, because the meat was different, darker, better marbled, carrying something in its character that Inez said was the difference between an animal that had lived and an animal that had merely been produced. Cora accepted this compliment on behalf of her land and her pigs' relationship with the land, which was the actual subject of the compliment. She was pulling in a reliable $4,200 per quarter from the butcher contract. Her expenses, feed supplementation, which was modest, because the pasture and the rootable ground carried the herd through most of the year, fencing materials, property taxes, the small monthly payment on a used water tank she'd purchased to supplement the spring flow during dry spells ran to roughly $2,100 per quarter. She was netting, after everything, something close to $8,400 per year on land that had sold at auction for back taxes of $3,400. She wrote this down in her notebook with no exclamation and no celebration, and the same handwriting she used for everything else. The column had balanced. It kept balancing. Petra Wilkes was 12 now and came every day after school and on weekends. She had developed, over the 3 years, a facility with pigs that was close to uncanny. She could read a sow's intention from 40 feet away, could predict a farrowing almost to the hour, could move the herd between paddocks with a set of signals that were part gesture and part some quality of attention that Cora had stopped trying to explain. Cora had begun paying her $7 an hour and had opened a savings account in the girl's name at the town bank, putting the money in there each month with a regularity of a ledger entry. Petra had not mentioned this to anyone, as far as Cora could tell. She kept it the way Cora kept most things, quietly as a private running account. The blight came in the 4th spring, and it came hard. It was not a disease of pigs. Cora's herd remained stubbornly healthy on its native pasture and spring water, a fact she noted without comment, but a drought that arrived in March and did not ease. The county had not seen a dry spell this complete since a bad year in the mid-90s, and by May, the shallow wells that watered most of the county's conventional operations were drawing down. Cleet Purvis's pastures, which had never been rested or rotated in any systematic way, began to show the bone of the earth by June. The stock ponds that Delaney Marsh's leased operations depended on dropped 1.5 feet in 6 weeks. The certified purebred Durocs that Marsh had been running on his best leased ground, animals so finely bred that the county extension newsletter had written a small piece about them the previous autumn, began to show ribs. The cedar thicket that Cora had spent 3 years removing had, it turned out, been doing something else beyond intercepting water. It had been protecting the shallow limestone formation that fed her spring from the worst of the evaporative draw during dry years. With the cedar gone and the native pasture established, the root systems of the grasses and forbs she had seeded were holding soil moisture in a shallow biotic layer that the bare and overgrazed ground of the adjacent operations could not replicate. The spring ran lower in the drought, down to 6 gallons per hour, at its lowest reading in July, but it ran. It did not stop. Cora's pigs were not thin. They rooted in ground that was dry on the surface but moist below, following the water table by instinct, and they ate the native pasture down, and the pasture came back, slowly, the way things that have deep roots come back. She supplemented with purchased feed through the worst of it, an additional expense of $600 across the summer. But her animals were sound and her operation continued. The whisper started in June. Cora heard it second-hand from Vidor Zenther, who heard it from his daughter, who heard it at the feed co-op. People were saying, the Vass woman on the East Crook must be hauling water in, must be buying expensive feed. She wasn't accounting for, must have some arrangement they didn't know about. It is easier, Cora had found, To believe a thing is hidden or dishonest than to admit you were wrong about it for 4 years. The community had not moved smoothly from mockery to admiration. It had moved sideways first into suspicion, which is the place people go when they find out they were wrong and want someone else to be at fault for it. Delaney Marsh did not come to the fence in July with the folded paper. He was smarter than that. He came at the end of September, after the drought had officially broken with 4 inches of rain in 5 days, rain that replenished the shallow wells and refilled the stock ponds to a serviceable level, but did not undo 4 months of condition loss in animals already stressed. He came with the folded paper and the truck and the chrome and the smile, and he stood at the fence Cora had strung with her own 2 hands on the November morning that opens this story, and he named his number. The number was $11,000 for the 38 acres complete, water rights included. He named it like a man handing someone a life preserver. He said it was a generous offer given the market. He said the market for small, isolated parcels was not strong, which was a sentence that told her what he thought she knew about markets. He said he admired what she had done with the place, truly, and that he thought she deserved to walk away from it with something in her pocket and not have to fight what was shaping up to be a hard recovery winter. And all of this, the admiration, the concern, the market commentary, was the verbal equivalent of the folded paper. A thing that looked like an offer but functioned as a ceiling, meant to be the last number she ever heard. He had in the pause after the number the slight self-satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. Cora had watched that expression before. She had seen it in clients who were about to discover that their books did not say what they thought they said. She asked him a question. She asked it quietly, in the level voice she used for questions that already knew their answers. She said, "How did you know about the spring output in July?" Delaney Marsh's expression moved in a way he did not intend, a small movement, but the kind that a careful observer does not miss. He said he didn't know what she meant. Cora said she had not told anyone the July flow figures except to note them in her private notebook and mentioned them once to Vidor Senti. She had written down 6 gallons per hour. She said this slowly. She said she was curious how a man who had been watching her operation from a distance had arrived today with a number $11,000 that precisely reflected his knowledge of a temporary drought reduction in a spring that he should not have known was there at all, let alone been monitoring. Marsh said something about the county water table being publicly tracked, which was true as far as it went, and false in the application, because the county water monitoring did not map individual spring boxes on private parcels. Cora listened to him say this without expression. Then she said, "Cleet Purvis has been watching my spring." Marsh did not answer. The silence was its own kind of accounting entry. Cora picked up her notebook from the fence post where she'd set it, and she turned to a page she had prepared 3 days earlier when she'd first heard from Ines Varela that Delaney Marsh had been asking around about her operation with a curiosity that went beyond casual. On the page she had written a number. She turned it toward him. The number was $68,000. She explained it the way a bookkeeper explains a balance, not with drama, but with precision. 38 acres of productive pasture ground with a flowing limestone spring, currently running 17 pigs per paddock across 7 paddocks on a 28-day rotation, producing an annual net of $8,400, on which a conservative land value multiplier, which she had rounded up to 68,000 to account for the established herd genetics and the spring infrastructure, which was not publicly valued anywhere because no one had known it existed until she had found it. She said, "This is what the land is worth, not what it cost. What it is worth." Marsh looked at the number for a moment. The smile that had been doing the work of his manners was no longer working. He said that was not a realistic market figure for this part of the county. Cora said she was not discussing the market, she was discussing the land. She said, the arithmetic of what a thing costs and the arithmetic of what a thing produces are two different calculations, and conflating them is either an error or a strategy, and she was not interested in either. There was a silence then that lasted long enough to be the real answer to everything he'd said. Petra Wilkes was sitting on the fence 50 feet away, watching the pigs work in the far paddock, pretending not to listen in the way of a 12-year-old who is listening to every word and filing it. Basin was somewhere in the cedar dark at the parcel's remaining edge, doing what she had always done. Cora said, "I'm not selling to you." She said it without heat. She said it like the final line of a column that has been correctly totaled. What happened after that was not a single dramatic moment. It accumulated the way the water had accumulated in the spring box. Slowly, quietly, undeniably. The county did not wake up the next morning and declare Cora Vass a visionary. Unities are not built that way. What happened was more incremental and more durable. Cleet Purvis came to Cora's fence in October. The other fence, the north fence, not the one where Marsh had stood. And he stood there with his hat in his hands, in a posture that was entirely different from any posture she had seen from him before. And he asked about her rotation system. He asked about the native seed mix. He asked, looking at the ground, about the spring. Cora told him what he asked. She did not make him earn it any more than he had already earned it by coming at all. That, she understood, was the only revenge worth having. Not the withholding, but the giving. By November, she had had the same conversation in various forms with 4 of the small operators whose parcels bordered hers or lay in the same water table zone. She had walked each of them through the rotation, logic, the cedar clearing method, the spring box, identification that turned out to be a second buried spring box on a neighboring parcel, unmapped and dry. At the base of a cedar stand, the neighbor had been meaning to clear for a decade. The neighbor, a woman named Sis Darrow, who ran a small cow-calf operation on inherited ground, cleared the cedar over the following winter with her son's help, using a rented track skid steer and 7 borrowed pigs from Cora's herd. The spring ran by April, not as strong as Cora's, 4 gallons per hour at the outset, rising to 9 by summer. But it ran. Vidor Senthe came on a Thursday in late November, the week the first real cold came and the pigs had been moved to the winter paddock near the shed. He walked slowly through the cleared ground and looked at the native pasture going dormant under frost and at the spring box running steady and clear in the cold air, the water steaming faintly. He stopped at the box and pressed his stick into the earth. He said, "You understand now what I said." Cora said she thought she did. He said it again, as he had said it at the beginning. The route that closes a thing is the same route that shows you where the thing is. The third time, it landed like a benediction. Cora had been offered, in the months after the confrontation with Marsh, 4 other purchase inquiries from people who had watched the drought and watched her herd and put the story together. None of them were predatory. They were the inquiries of people beginning to understand what healthy land looked like and wanting some part of it. She declined all of them. Not because she intended to hold forever, but because the land was not finished yet. The western slope still had cedar in the upper quarter. There were 2 paddocks whose native grass establishment had been slow and uneven and needed another year of careful rotation and possibly overseeding. There was a market garden plan she had been sketching in the notebook since the second summer, a half-acre plot downslope from the spring where the water ran and the ground was deep and dark that she intended to begin in the spring. Petra had already chosen which vegetables. The account was not closed, it was current. Delaney Marsh did not leave the county. Men like Delaney Marsh do not leave the county. What happened was smaller and more precise. The transport contract he held lost 2 of its 5 operators in the year after the drought, operators who had watched how Cora sold her animals and who had found, now that they knew it was possible, their own arrangements with small, regional buyers. The contract did not collapse, but it shrank, and the price he could offer shrank proportionally, and the leverage he held over small operators shrank with it, not because anyone had organized against him, but because the arithmetic had simply stopped favoring him the way it once had. He was still comfortable. He would remain comfortable. But the number on his folded paper was no longer the last number anyone heard. Inez Varela doubled her contract with Cora in the spring of the 5th year and added a second arrangement for a small cured pork line she was developing, which required older animals of consistent quality and flavor. Exactly the kind of animal that Cora's rotation system and native pasture and spring water produced, animals that had lived a long, rooting, purposeful life on ground they'd helped to make. The contract was for 20 animals per year at a premium price. Cora wrote the number in her notebook and looked at it for a moment, and then turned the page. Petra Wilkes turned 14 that June. Cora had been putting $40 a month in the savings account for 2 years, which came to $960. She did not present it with ceremony. She showed Petra the account balance on a slip from the bank and said, "This is yours." Petra looked at the number. She said, "That's from the work." Cora said, "Yes." Petra said nothing else for a moment, and then said, "I want to buy a gilt." Cora thought about this. She said the best gilt in the current spring litter was going to be worth something real. Petra said she knew that. She named the gilt. She said, "I want Morrow's daughter, the small one with the even keel." Cora said, "That's going to cost you 400 of it." Petra said she had thought about that. Cora sold her the gilt for $400, which she deposited back into the savings account in Petra's name, and showed her the updated balance, $560 remaining. A beginning, exactly one person alone, which is a sentence if you say it with a period at the end, and something else entirely if you say it as a starting position. Vidos Zen's knees were worse that winter, and he came on Thursdays less often. But he came when the weather allowed, and when he came he walked the ground and made his sounds of consideration, and occasionally said something worth writing down. He had an expression for the state of the land now that was different from the word he would have used 4 years ago. He used the word settled, not in the sense of stilled, but in the sense of a foundation that has found its depth. He said the land knew what it was for now. He said it was possible to feel that in the ground if you knew what feeling to look for. The last Thursday before Christmas that year, he stood at the spring box, full to the rim and running as it had run since September of the 2nd year, and would run, Cora believed, as long as the limestone underneath held and the pasture above was cared for, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said what he had said twice before, the third time becoming something final and whole. The root that closes a thing is the same root that shows you where the thing is. Cora stood beside him and looked at the water running in the cold light. The pasture behind them was winter pale and dormant, but not dead. Dormancy and death being 2 entirely different entries in any honest ledger. The pigs were quiet in their paddock, their shapes moving in the low afternoon light like a rumor of what the spring would bring. Petra was somewhere behind them, filling water troughs with the attentiveness she brought to everything, her boots crunching on the frost. Somewhere on the western slope, a cedar bough shifted in the wind and released its smell, that particular cold cedar smell that Cora associated now not with the loss of what that smell had represented when she first walked the parcel, but with the work of finding what was under it. She was not the woman the county had watched bid alone on a parcel of back-taxed cedar ground and ridden off as a grief-made error. She was not exactly a different woman either. She was the same woman standing on ground that had told her the truth when she had been quiet enough and patient enough to hear it. The spring ran, the pigs moved, the accounts were current, and for the first time in a very long time. Perhaps since Arlen, perhaps since before. They were more than current. They were getting ahead. She said nothing. Neither did Vidor Senthi. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has done its arithmetic and found the sum correct. That is enough. That is, as it turned out, more than enough. Worth is not what a thing costs when you acquire it in the cold. Worth is what it becomes when you bring everything you have to what everyone else has decided is finished. The route that closes a thing is the same route that shows you where the thing is. It is easier to believe a thing is worthless than to admit you are wrong to walk past it. And being right, quietly, stubbornly, season by counted season, right is its own reply, and it unnerves far longer and far deeper than any argument that was ever made in a loud voice at a fence line in November.